Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this Theme D, Peace and Conflict Revision walkthrough. I'm Wardle, and we are covering everything you need to know for Theme D, Peace and Conflict. This is, of course, for the AQA Paper 2 exam, in which you need to answer questions on 4 themes. Remember, you need to answer the questions on the 4 themes you have been studying in your RE lessons. Do not try and answer every theme in the booklet. Focus on those 4 themes that you are an expert on. And so we're going to work through all of the topics that could come up on Theme D today. Do make sure you have clicked on the link below to get the revision walkthrough booklet and also this PowerPoint. We'll start, for example, by filling in the keywords for Theme D. And then we will be going through each of the topics that could come up in the exam. And you'll be able to fill in your Christian beliefs on the left and then your Islamic beliefs on the right. So yes, lots to talk about. Let's get started, shall we, with a quick overview of the Theme D specification. So remember, we will be asked 5 questions on Theme D, totaling 24 marks, and these are the topics that could come up. So we've got peace, justice, forgiveness and reconciliation. We need to know what those keywords mean and also their significance. We need to talk about violence and different attitudes towards violence, including violent protest. Should violent protest ever be used, for example? We'll be looking at terrorism and religious responses to this. We're then looking at war, really important topic. We'll be looking at reasons for war. We'll be looking at just war theory in both Christianity, in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, and also the Quran in terms of Surah 2 and the Lesser Jihad. And we'll be looking at holy war as well. We'll be taking a look at pacifism and contrasting beliefs about pacifism. And we'll also be looking at religion and belief as a cause of war and violence in the contemporary world today. We're then looking at weapons of mass destruction, another contrasting beliefs topic, including nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and then the use of weapons of mass destruction. And we'll then conclude with a nice look at religion and peacemaking. And that's a great chance to look at some case studies. We'll be looking at individuals and organizations that work for peace, and we'll be looking at the religious teachings and scriptural quotes that inspire them to do so. So we've got a lot to talk about, and I thought we could start by having a look at how we're actually going to apply this, because there is no point, is there, going through all these topics and not actually considering how we'll apply them in the exam to secure all the marks we want for a grade 9. So remember, you are going to be asked 5 questions on Theme D. Your 1-mark question, where you've got to tick the correct word. Your 2-marker, where you've got to give 2 bullet points about the topic. We've then, of course, got the 4-marker, which is where we have to explain 2 similar or contrasting, and obviously that means clearly different views on an issue. We've then got our 5-marker, where we explain 2 different beliefs about the issue, but this time with explicit reference to scripture for 1. And then, of course, our 12-marker, where we have got to evaluate the statement. And for this, we need to give 2 evidenced and explained reasons to agree with the statement, 2 evidenced and explained reasons to disagree with the statements before reaching our own justified conclusion. And if you do all of those things, you are going to secure 24 out of 24 and get that grade 9. So let's start, shall we, with a look at the key terms. And remember, these key terms are important, not just for question 1, where you've got to tick the correct word, but also throughout the Theme D section, because they'll be coming up in the questions and we will want to use them in our answers. So on page 3 of the booklet, if you are following along, you will find this table here, and you will find that the keywords are actually missing, because you might like to actually see how many of the keywords you can remember. The only clue I'm going to give you is that they are in alphabetical order. So that might help you with your recall. So yes, pause the video if you like, see how many of the keywords you already know, and then we shall talk through them today. So let's talk through them, shall we? Here they are on the screen for you. Your first keyword is conflict, and that means dispute between sides, and it can be between individuals, groups, or nations. We've then got forgiveness, which means letting go of blame against a person for wrongs they have done and moving on. And we'll be looking at the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, because whereas forgiveness is about letting go and moving on, reconciliation is about going one step further and then actively rebuilding that relationship. Our next keyword is holy war, which is war that is believed to be sanctioned by God. We then have justice, which means bringing fairness back to a situation. Just war, then, is a set of rules for fighting a war in a way believed to be justified and acceptable to God. Nuclear deterrence is the next key word. It means having nuclear weapons with the aim of deterring or preventing other states attacking for fear of retaliation and nuclear war, possibly leading to what we call mutually assured destruction, which is important and we'll talk about later. We then have nuclear weapons, a weapon of mass destruction, which causes widespread damage and loss of life. Nuclear war would be a war fought using these weapons. Pacifism then is belief that all violence is wrong, which then affects all behaviours. Peace means the opposite of war. It's harmony between all in society. Peacemaking is then the practical step of working to bring about peace and reconciliation. Protest is a statement or action to express disagreement. It can be an organised event to demonstrate disagreement with a policy or political action. Reconciliation means making up and rebuilding relationships between two sides or groups after disagreement. Retribution means to pay someone back for their harmful actions. So the idea of an eye for an eye, which could be a reason people use violence. Terrorism means the use of violence and threats to intimidate others, used for political purposes to build fear in the ordinary population and to secure demands from government. Victims of war are those who are harmed during a war, for example, those killed, injured, or left homeless. Violence means behaviour involving physical force which intends to hurt, kill, or cause damage. War is armed conflict between two or more sides, and then weapons of mass destruction are weapons which can cause widespread, indiscriminate damage. For example, nuclear weapons, which we've focused on, but also chemical and biological weapons. So let's start with our first topic. If I can get the PowerPoint to work. There we go, guys. Few technical difficulties, but we can now get started because we need to know about peace, justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation and why they're important for both Christians and Muslims. So why do Christians believe these four things are important? Well, peace is important because Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And he said that in his very important Sermon on the Mount, which he delivered to his followers. And it has inspired many people, as we will see when we look at our case studies, to work for peace in the world today. Justice then is very important because Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, teaches to seek justice. So a really easy quote to remember there. Forgiveness. Why is forgiveness important? Well, Jesus said to forgive not 7, but 77 times. And he's not telling his followers to keep an exact tally, but the message behind that quote is that you should not tire of forgiving. Yeah, you should always be ready to forgive others. Don't limit how many times you will forgive. He also taught that if you forgive others, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. So really important, you know, that if you want to be forgiven by God, and remember, Christians believe that all people are sinful and so they all do need forgiveness. If you want to be forgiven by God, you've got to be prepared to forgive others. And then reconciliation. Why is rebuilding relationships important? Well, it is, of course, another example of peacemaking, but it's also important because God reconciled himself to us through Christ, as St. Paul writes. Yes, so Christians are inspired by, you know, the acts of atonement on the cross and the reconciliation that is brought about between God and humanity, which emphasizes the importance of reconciliation in Christianity, you know, reflecting the fact that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God. He is the ultimate teacher, the ultimate role model for Christians. So, you know, reconciliation, rebuilding relationships is really important. In terms of your Islamic beliefs on these key four concepts, peace, well, Surah 23 says to say words of peace. So, you know, you need to be going out there, saying words of peace, working for peace in the world today. In terms of justice, Surah 4 says to stand up firmly for justice. You need to stand up for justice, emphasizing its importance. The Hadiths say on the topic of forgiveness that you should forgive others and God will also forgive you. Remember, the Hadiths are the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. And finally, reconciliation. The Hadiths say that whoever makes reconciliation, his reward is from God. So obviously it's something that God wants to encourage, that he wants to see, because he will then reward it. So of course, it's something you will actively want to do and bring about in your everyday life. Let's talk about violence then, shall we? And we're going to start with your Christian beliefs on violence, including violent protests. So, what negative attitudes towards violence can we see in Christianity? Well, Jesus taught that those who live by the sword die by the sword, emphasizing that if you use violence, you will ultimately meet a violent end. So you are risking your own life. Yeah. So he says you should avoid it because it will ultimately cause you considerable harm. He also taught that you should not use violence, but that instead you should turn the other cheek. So even if somebody has used violence towards you, you should not respond with violence. Violence is wrong in all circumstances, including as retaliation. If we look in the Old Testament, Exodus teaches do not kill. And of course, violence could lead to the loss of life, which goes against that commandment. So obviously it would be seen as wrong. St. Paul taught that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so your body should not be harmed, but should be looked after. And of course, that links in with that key Christian belief that all people are made imago Dei, in the image of God. And then not Pope Francis, don't know where his name came from, always thinking of him. He's always got something to say. I meant to say Martin Luther King Jr. Do excuse me, just as important. He said we must pursue peace through peaceful means. And so even in the case of protest, you should never resort to violence because we can only achieve peaceful ends by using peaceful means. And he said we must only ever use the weapon of love. So in order to pursue peace, we have to use peaceful means. So that would be against violent protest as well. In terms of more positive attitudes towards violence, then, the Old Testament teaches eye for an eye. Yeah, so you could use violence in revenge or retaliation. And St. Thomas Aquinas used his doctrine of double effect to justify using violence in self-defense. For example, if your intention is to protect yourself from harm rather than cause harm to somebody else, you could be justified in using violence. If your intention is self-defense, if you're acting to protect yourself rather than harm the person. And then Jesus himself, on the subject of violent protest, actually violently protested. Now, he didn't harm anybody when he did this, but according to Matthew 21, he overturned the tables of money changers in the temple in protest at the commercialization of the temple. He said, "You have made my Father's house a den of robbers." And so it could be argued that violence is sometimes justified as part of protest in reaction to injustice, in order to make a bold statement, to make a point about how wrong something is, that you can't just stand by. In terms of your Islamic beliefs, then, we're going to start again with your negative attitudes. So Surah 23 teaches to say words of peace. And Islam is often described as a religion of peace. You know, peace is seen as the priority. And so that must be the priority in your life, that you should be saying words of peace. You should seek peaceful resolutions. Surah 2 teaches that God gave you life. So, of course, this again is about sanctity of life. All life is sacred and holy because it has been created by God. And so you should not cause harm to anybody as their life is sacred. You know, we also read in the Quran, do not kill yourself or others. And then Surah 7 teaches God created you from a single soul. And that, of course, emphasizes the oneness of humanity. We should live in harmony and not use violence. Yeah, and you can link that to the idea of the Ummah, the worldwide Islamic community as well, that it's all about unity and togetherness. In terms of more positive attitudes to violence, though, Surah 2, which we'll talk about a lot today, teaches to fight in the way of God those who fight you. So that suggests there are times when violence may be justified, for example, for self-defense or in defense of the religion. And we will talk about lesser jihad and just war theory later on. Oh no, we'll actually talk about it now. Didn't notice that bullet point there. Do excuse me, guys, I need some green tea. Because lesser jihad means to fight in defense of the religion. Excuse me. So it shows that violence may sometimes be justifiable. You know, it is an option. It is something that can happen, but there are strict conditions for that. You know, Surah 2 says, do not transgress, do not overstep the limits. But as I say, more on that to come very soon. For now, we're going to look at terrorism. And terrorism is really important on the topic, on the exam, because all Christians and Muslims agree that it's always wrong. And so we're going to have a look at some of the reasons why it is always condemned by Christians and Muslims. So Why do Christians believe it is wrong? Well, Exodus teaches do not kill. And of course, the intention behind it is to kill innocent civilians going about their everyday lives. Genesis teaches that God said, let us make man in our image and likeness. And of course, that leads to the Imago Dei doctrine that all humans are made in the image of God. And so again, innocent civilians should never be killed. St. Paul writes that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. So that idea that life is sacred, the sanctity of life argument, and so it needs to be protected and cared for. Nobody should be killed. St. Paul writes to live at peace with everyone. And, you're not living at peace with them if you're trying to blow them up as they get on a bus or they go on a tube train, for example, with the London 2005 bombings. And then Pope Francis, you see, there he is. I knew he was coming up somewhere. He said, we cannot be silent when terrorism abuses religion. And of course, he's acknowledging there that many terrorists use religion as the reason for their actions. And he is saying that that is an abuse of religion, that actually we cannot be silent when people do this. So we need to stand up and say, this is not true to the religion. Yeah, it's not an accurate representation of this religion's values and teachings, that someone would go and kill innocent civilians in the name of God, for example. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that terrorism is gravely against justice and charity. So it's unjust and it's unkind and uncaring, because as I say, you are targeting innocent people as they go about their everyday lives. So, really clear in that condemnation there. In terms of your Islamic beliefs, why it's wrong, Surah 4 teaches do not kill yourself or others. And of course, it's significant that many terrorist attacks are suicide attacks. So the individual themselves is killed in the process of killing others. And so that would go against both parts of that verse there. Do not kill yourself or others. Surah 17 teaches do not take life, which God has made sacred. So again, sanctity of life arguments, you shouldn't be taking life, especially in such an unjust way. Surah 7 teaches that whoever has killed a soul, it is though he has killed all mankind. So again, emphasizing why murder and causing death is wrong. Muhammad Ali said that Islam is peace and not violence. This is a religion of peace. You should be saying words of peace, as the surahs also tell us. So, you should not be trying to cause terror. Think about it. It's not just about taking life. It's about causing terror and disharmony and fear amongst the general population. And so it would go against that key core belief in Islam in the importance of bringing about peace. And then Surah 2 says, do not overstep the limits in terms of a just war. So, violence causing death can only be justified, in a very limited way. You should not overstep the limits. And arguably, flying a plane into a tower, for example, or blowing up a bus, or, whatever it is in terms of your terrorist attack example, that is overstepping the limits. It's not appropriate because you're killing innocent people, and, you're causing terror and fear and panic. The Muslim Council of Britain say that the vast majority of Muslims condemn terrorism wholeheartedly, unequivocally, and they say the Muslim Council of Britain have consistently condemned terrorism and looked for meaningful ways to challenge terrorism. So, they're a really important authority on Islamic matters in the UK, and they have been very clear in their condemnation, saying that Muslims condemn terrorism, and they, as the Muslim Council of Britain, have consistently condemned terrorism. They are very clear that it is wrong, and it is their Islamic beliefs and values which tell them it is wrong, because you are killing innocent people. It is very unjust. It is not recognizing the sanctity of life and the fact that this is a religion of peace. Okay, our next topic then is war. Really important as a topic, and we're going to start with our Christian beliefs. And we're going to start with just war theory, which we associate with St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he didn't invent it, but he was very, very influential in shaping it into what it is today. And remember, it is still used by the Catholic Church today. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says there are strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force. And the Church says that you require rigorous consideration. So the key quote you need to know for the exam there is that there are strict conditions when military force may be justified. And they are found in Aquinas' just war criteria. And this is the idea of a set of rules for fighting a war in a just way. And we have two sections to this. We have jus ad bellum, which is about the criteria to consult before going to war. And then we have jus ad bello, which is the criteria to consult during the war. So these two separate sections of the just war theory. The first one is about the criteria to consult before the war, so deciding whether we can justify going to war, whereas the second set, jus ad bello, is about consultation during the war. Are we using justifiable methods? Are the methods we're using justifiable? Is it just to do this as part of the war? So let's start with our jus ad bellum, our criteria to consult prior to declaring war. This is how you decide whether to declare a war, whether it should start in the first place. And we've got that it's declared by a legitimate authority. We've got that it has a just cause, that it has the right intention, that it's being fought as the last resort, that you've exhausted all other options, negotiation, for example, and that there is a reasonable chance of success. We then have the jus ad bello, which is to be consulted during the war. And this is that innocent civilians must not be targeted. And of course, that links in with terrorism and why that is wrong, because it is innocent civilians being directly targeted as they go about their everyday lives. And then the use of force must be proportionate. And that is going to link in when we talk about weapons of mass destruction and whether they are proportionate. So that is your criteria. They are your 7 points. And St. Thomas Aquinas says this is what you have to consult in terms of working out whether a war can be justified, whether it can be fought, and if so, how it should then be fought. And as I say, your Catholic Church teaching today is that there are strict conditions, but they require rigorous consideration. You have to be able to meet that criteria. You can't just go to war or support a war on a whim because you feel like it, because you've woken up in a bad mood. There is a really clear set of rules for consulting before and then during. St. Paul, as another point, said that you must submit to the governing authorities. And you could use this if you're writing about war, because you could say if the government has declared war, you should support the war effort. You should submit to the governing authorities. Now, we're going to talk about conscientious objectors when we talk about pacifism. But the idea here is that if the government, if your MPs, if the Prime Minister have decided, they have voted, they have decreed that a war is required, then it's your job as a good citizen in that country to submit to their decision. So, for example, if there's conscription, you must go and fight. You must play your part in the war effort as required by your government. In terms of opposition to war, however, and we will talk about this more when we discuss pacifists even, can't speak today, do excuse me. We've got the Quakers. They are Christian pacifists who utterly deny all outward wars. We've also got Martin Luther King Jr., who said we must use the weapon of love. So the only weapon you can use is love, because he said we must pursue peace through peaceful means. And so he believed you could never achieve peace if you don't use peaceful methods. And so war would be seen as wrong and as futile, as pointless. In terms of your Islamic beliefs, then, the idea of the lesser jihad is so important for us here. And we find this in Surah 2, which teaches to fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. So this is, again, a kind of Islamic version of just war theory, because it's teaching war can be justified in self-defense or in defense of the religion, but it must be fought in the correct way. Do not overstep the limits, as Surah 2 says, in the same way that, Aquinas was saying innocent civilians cannot be targeted and that the use of force must be proportionate. It must be fought in the right way. Do not go too far. And of course, Muhammad, who is described by the Quran as the perfect man, he is the key exemplar and role model for Muslims. He himself fought in holy wars, for example, the conquest of Mecca in the earliest days of the religion. And so if he fought in war, that could suggest, couldn't it, that Muslims can follow in his footsteps, because they turn to the hadith to see what he said, but then to the sunnah to see his actions. So he is clearly a key role model. So if he's done something, that would suggest that you can do it as well in terms of living a good Islamic life. So there are times, there are circumstances when war can be justified. However, if we are talking about Islamic attitudes against war or Islamic opposition to war, you could use Muhammad Ali. He refused to fight when he was required to. in a war, and so he lost his boxing license. He would not go and fight in the Vietnam War, and so he was stripped of his professional boxing license. He said that Islam is peace and not violence. So he said his religious beliefs meant he would not use violence. Obviously, I know the irony that he was a boxer, but he said, I will not fight in the war. Surah 4 says, do not kill yourself or others. So, of course, in war, there is risk that you will die, but you will also cause other people to die as well. And Surah 5 says, whoever kills a soul, it is though he has killed all mankind. And again, it is that idea that war inevitably is going to involve death. In terms of holy wars then, which are wars, as we know, believed to have been sanctioned by God, we do have key case studies from history that we need to know. And we've got to consider about, how religion has been a cause of violence in the past, how it's been a cause of war in the past, and also the situation today when religion might be a cause of violence and war in the world today. So in terms of your Christian examples of holy war, we've got the Crusades, and a quote from the Bible, which could be seen as support in holy war, is Numbers 31 in the Old Testament, which says, take vengeance. In terms of your Islamic holy wars, then, obviously we've mentioned Muhammad's conquest of Mecca. Yeah, that violence, that war in the earliest days of the religion, when Muhammad, obviously after the Hijrah, where he fled to Medina, did then return to Mecca. And then with the conquest of Mecca, he did actually obviously win that war. And that is seen as being with God's help. Yeah, so that's why it's seen as a holy war, that it was with God's help. And Surah 9 is key here because Surah 9 says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. So obviously that reflected the holy wars of the time, that Islam was a monotheistic religion in a very polytheistic context, and that religion was a cause of war, and we see that a lot in those early days of religions. Yeah, remember, monotheism today is the mainstream religious approach, if I can call it that, isn't it? Our Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are, dominant in the world today. But actually, when those religions were first originating, it was a very radical belief. So it was a cause of violence. But you could argue in an essay that actually today, when the majority of the world's theists are monotheists, they believe in one God, religion is no longer such a cause of conflict. Although, of course, we do have conflicts, for example, in many countries in terms of different denominations of the same religion, different groups. We then also have people using religion as an excuse for violence. As Pope Francis said, we cannot be silent when terrorism abuses religion. So in terms of if you did get a question on religion and belief as a cause of violence, you could absolutely talk about holy wars in the past and how unique monotheism was at one point, but now the fact so many people are monotheists means that is no longer a cause of war. However, you could, of course, then link in that those denominational conflicts that still take place, and how people's beliefs are so important to them, that ultimately, religion can become a cause of war. And so that's where you'd bring in holy war. Okay, we're going to talk about pacifism, and this is a key belief because it's the idea that war, violence are always wrong under all circumstances, under any circumstances. You cannot ever use violence. You cannot ever go to war. We're going to start with our Christian beliefs, and we're going to ask why a Christian would be pacifist. And remember, our key case study here is the Quakers. Our key man is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. So let's start with our Quakers. They are Christian pacifists. They utterly deny all outward wars. So you can have, an inner struggle for self-discipline and to be a good person, but in terms of outward wars, physical wars, they are utterly denied. And so a Quaker may be a conscientious objector, to conscription. So, if there was conscription in place, if the government declared a war, a Quaker may conscientiously object, the way you object to being conscripted on the grounds of your belief. You could say, I refuse to fight because of my beliefs. So they are a denomination who are pacifist. Jesus himself is known as the Prince of Peace, and he taught his followers that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So that does suggest, doesn't it, that you shouldn't use your sword, you shouldn't use violence, because, you know, it's ultimately going to harm you. Nothing good can come of it. St. Paul writes to live at peace with everyone. So that could suggest you must always prioritize peace. You should never resort to violence, and in this case, war. And then Martin Luther King Jr. said that you must pursue peace through peaceful means, and that you must use the weapon of love. So the only weapon you can ever use is love. And of course, he's basing that on Jesus himself, who, you know, focused on love, didn't he? In terms of negative attitudes to pacifism, then, the Catholic Church, of course, as we now know, believes that there are strict conditions when war is justifiable. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, set out criteria for when war may be justified. So although they're not encouraging it, they wouldn't agree with the pacifist view that it's never justified, because there are certain circumstances, there are strict conditions when war may be justifiable. And then Jesus said, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So actually, you could then use Jesus again to be arguing, well, at the same time, he also seemed to support the use of violence in certain cases, you know, for certain causes. So, you know, a bit ambiguous there. You can definitely be using Jesus to both support pacifism, but also then to question whether it's the right approach. In terms of a secular position, you could talk about utilitarianism, the idea that the greatest good to the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong. And so you could say that the end may sometimes justify the means when it comes to war, that sometimes going to war can be justified by what you're going to achieve by doing so. Yeah. So the greatest good to the greatest number is to be the measure of right and wrong. And that is from Jeremy Bentham, a key figure in developing utilitarianism alongside John Stuart Mill, who developed it later on. And you could say from that secular viewpoint that sometimes it is justified. And we call that teleological ethics, where you assess whether something is moral based on the outcome, based on the, you know, the end product of that. And you could say, you know, if the war is being fought to get rid of some awful, evil dictator, for example, could it be justified because it's the greatest good to the greatest number? In terms of your Islamic beliefs, then, what about your positive attitudes to pacifism? Well, Muhammad Ali said that Islam is peace and not violence. Surah 4, as we know, teaches do not kill yourselves or others. And Surah 7 says God created you from a single soul, and so you should live at peace with all people, avoid conflict and any disharmony. However, we need to know that the majority of Muslims, although they wouldn't encourage war, they would not be pacifist. So why is that? Well, the lesser jihad is the idea it is sometimes necessary to fight in war, for example, for self-defense. Muhammad himself, who is the perfect man and exemplar for Muslims, fought in holy wars, such as the conquest of Mecca. And then Surah 2, of course, your key scripture, is to fight in the way of God those who fight you, which shows that it's sometimes justifiable to fight in a war. In terms then of our next topic, weapons of mass destruction, and this is a contrasting beliefs topic. So you must know your contrasting beliefs about weapons of mass destruction, which are described by the United Nations as the most dangerous weapons on Earth. Nuclear weapons are described as the most dangerous weapons on Earth. And of course, lots of conversation and coverage in the news at the moment about weapons of mass destruction. The UK government, for example, has voted to renew the UK government's Trident nuclear submarine program. So we're going to be looking at why Christians may support weapons of mass destruction, even if it's just a nuclear deterrence approach where you have the weapons but you don't want or intend to ever use them. And then we'll also be looking at opposition, and then we'll do the same for Islam, of course. So what about our support for these weapons of mass destruction? Well, St. Paul writes, submit to the governing authorities. So Christians should support the UK government's policy of having a nuclear weapons programme, which they do, for example, as a deterrent. And as I say, that is called Trident, and it has been renewed. So the idea is, if the MPs, if the Prime Minister think it's needed, you should submit to that decision. You should support that decision. St. Thomas Aquinas' just war criteria we can absolutely bring in here. It includes those criteria of last resort and just cause, doesn't it? And so weapons of mass destruction could potentially meet this criteria, justifying their possession as a deterrent. We could also bring in the Old Testament. and that key teaching of eye for an eye. So that could justify using weapons of mass destruction in retaliation to someone else using theirs. Although the problem with that is it could then lead to mutually assured destruction. Pope Benedict XVI, for example, said in a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims. So the idea there is that if you allowed someone to use them in retaliation, or if the government used them in retaliation, we'd then end up in a nuclear war where we'd all be killed. And it wouldn't just kill all human life, but it would kill all life, and the entire planet would be destroyed. So, you know, we have to think, would retaliation or revenge work here? But actually, is it too late? Once one weapon has been fired anyway, it's all over for all of us. So, you know, there's our happy thought for the day. So yeah, we will be talking about this idea of mutually assured destruction, emphasizing why they are so dangerous. In terms of your Christian opposition to them, then, we could actually then return to Thomas Aquinas's just war theory, because he stipulates in this, doesn't he, in his criteria, that just wars must be fought, in a proportionate way, and that innocent civilians cannot be targeted. Obviously, these weapons are going to target innocent civilians. They are going to be killed, hundreds and thousands of them. And of course, they're not really proportionate, you know, so is this really a proportionate weapon of war? Pope Benedict XVI, as we've mentioned, said that in a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims. They lead to mutually assured destruction, and so they cannot be justified. You could say even as a deterrent. You know, what's the point of having them if you're never able to use them, because their use would lead to mutually assured destruction. Genesis, of course, our first book in the Bible, teaches that God put man in the garden to take care of it. You're not really taking care of it if you're destroying it, are you? You know, nuclear weapons would destroy all life and, of course, the environment. So that idea of being a good steward is going to be called into question. Pope Francis said, let us be protectors of God's creation. Obviously, you're not protecting creation if you're destroying it in a nuclear war. So it would go against stewardship, as we've said. And then Exodus says, do not kill. And obviously, weapons of mass destruction are weapons of mass destruction. You are causing mass death. Yeah, you are going to have an extraordinary death toll, potentially 8 billion people by the end of that nuclear war. So yes, it's really not looking good, is it? In terms of your Islamic beliefs, then, why might a Muslim support this? Well, we read that if someone has attacked you, attack him just as he attacked you. So it's the idea that you could support the use of weapons of mass destruction in retaliation to their use against your country by another nuclear power. Yeah, again, revenge, retaliation, isn't it? But of course, we then have the problem of mutually assured destruction. In terms of your opposition, however, in terms of Surah 2, we obviously know fight in the way of God those who fight you, which would seemingly support, wouldn't it, the use of these weapons. However, Surah 2 says, do not overstep the limits. So, you know, when we then add on that bit, it changes the understanding, because weapons of mass destruction could be seen as overstepping the limits, as transgressing. They could lead to the mass loss of innocent life and obviously mutually assured destruction, the loss of all life on the planet. So as Surah 4 says, do not kill yourself or others. Well, if it's going to lead to mutually assured destruction, you are going to be killing yourself and every other person on the planet. And then the Hadith teach that God has appointed you his stewards. Nuclear war would destroy the environment and the entire world. And so it would go against, their use would go against that duty to be a Khalifa, to be a good steward. So it's not only human life you're destroying, but it's all life. And that obviously then calls into question that idea of stewardship and being a Khalifa, which of course we're familiar with from Theme D. Okay, we are nearly there now. Let's have a look at our final topic, which is religion and peacemaking. And we need to know why Christians work for peace, as well as some Christian peacemaker case studies, and why Muslims work for peace, alongside some Islamic peacemaker case studies. So let's start with our Christian beliefs. Why do Christians work for peace? Well, Jesus taught, blessed are the peacemakers. Brilliant quote that we can use for many topics in Theme D. So obviously you're going to be a peacemaker, because Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount said that this is an important thing to do. St. Paul taught to live at peace with everyone. So of course you're going to want to be a peacemaker to bring about that peace. Jesus, as we know, was known as the Prince of Peace. He is the key role model and teacher for Christians because he is divine. He is not just a man with an important message. He is the incarnate Son of God in the world. He is the Word made flesh. St. Teresa of Avila said that Christians should try to put Jesus's teachings into action in the world. She said, Christ has no body now but yours. So you need to be the change. You need to be Christ-like in the way you live your life. And that would involve working for peace. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., the main man of this theme, said to pursue peace using peaceful means. So you've got to pursue peace, and do it in a peaceful way. I think we call that peacemaking. In terms of Christian peacemakers, then, obviously Jesus we can use because he's known as the Prince of Peace. And in his Sermon on the Mount, he taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers," which inspires Christians to work for peace, putting Christ's teachings into action in the world today. We, of course, are going to mention Martin Luther King Jr., a US Baptist minister and civil rights activist. Now, he was a pacifist, as we know, who used peaceful methods to challenge racism and promote peace and equality. And he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Pax Christi is a global Catholic movement promoting peace and non-violence since 1945, obviously after the Second World War, inspired by Jesus, inspired by their Christian values, to work for peace. And then Christian Aid, they promote peace, but they also then help the victims of war, because they say everything we do is rooted in our Christian beliefs, which inspires them to work for peace, to be peacemakers. In terms of your Islamic beliefs then, so why do Muslims work for peace? Well, Surah 23 teaches to say words of peace, and the Quran is obviously seen as the infallible and inerrant word of God, and so if that's what Surah 23 commands, that's what you need to do. Surah 7 teaches that God has created you from a single soul, and so people should live in harmony, emphasizing the oneness of humanity. You know that idea of Tawheed being the oneness of God, and then you've got the oneness of humanity as well. Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, for example. The Hadith say that God has appointed you his stewards. Muslims believe, based on this teaching from Muhammad, they are God's caliphs, responsible for looking after creation, and that, of course, involves working for peace. You don't want, for example, a nuclear war that then destroys the entire planet. So that idea of the Ummah, that we have that worldwide Islamic community. So working for peace would support and strengthen the Ummah, the worldwide Islamic community, emphasizing why it's important. Muhammad Ali said that Islam is peace and not violence. So, of course, that's why it's important to promote and work for peace. And then finally, then, who are our Islamic peacemakers? Well, Muhammad Ali, again, another main man of Theme D, I think you'll agree. He was a Muslim pacifist who lost his professional boxing license when he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. He undertook charity work promoting peace and equality. And then finally, Islamic Relief. They work to tackle the causes and consequences of conflict as part of their work to help the most vulnerable. And they are inspired to put Islamic values such as compassion and justice into action, and that involves, as I say, tackling not only the consequences of conflicts, they're helping those affected by war, but also working to prevent it in the first place, to tackle those causes. And in the full Theme D video, we do have a section on the causes and consequences of war. So do make sure you have a look at that as part of your revision as well. But that is it from me today. Thank you for joining me. I do hope that's been helpful, and I will see you again soon.